But the paradise was doomed. As the waters vanished, so did the animals. And with them, the people faced a choice: die or move. And so they followed the last great river, the Nile, a journey of hundreds of miles guided by the promise of water, of life, of survival. What if everything you thought you knew about ancient Egypt was wrong? When you think of ancient Egypt, you imagine towering pyramids, mysterious hieroglyphs, and powerful pharaohs. But what if I told you much of what we think we know is wrong? They built pyramids to align with the heavens, but were the stars their only guide? They worshiped gods with animal heads, but did they see them as real beings? We were told the pyramids were built by slaves, beaten, starved, and forced into labor. But what if I told you that was a lie? The truth is far more astonishing than the legend. This, Sunni, is the real story of ancient Egypt. This is the real story of ancient Egypt. A world of gods, pyramids, and lost knowledge. A civilization unlike any before or since, or so we thought. 10,000 years ago, a green, fertile land, teeming with life. Herds of wild aurochs graze on lush grasslands. Hunters draped in animal skins move stealthily, tracking their prey. Egypt was once a paradise. 7,000 years ago, at a site called Nabta Playa, deep in the desert, the first great Egyptian settlement appeared. This is the birth of Hathor, the first goddess of Egypt. But why? And what were these people trying to predict? Before Egypt, before kings and gods, there was nothing but sand, or so we thought. For thousands of years, historians believed that civilization along the Nile simply emerged from scattered tribes. But beneath the shifting sands of the Sahara, new evidence tells a different story. One of catastrophe, survival, and the first great human migration that would lay the foundations for Egypt itself. Long before the pyramids, the Sahara was unrecognizable. 10,000 years ago, it was a green and fertile paradise. Vast savannas stretched across the land, teeming with life. Wild cattle, antelope, and hippos roamed freely. Nomadic tribes followed the herds, hunting, gathering, and thriving in a world that would soon vanish forever. Then the earth itself shifted. A minor tilt on its axis, just half a degree, triggered a chain reaction. The rains that had sustained this lush world began to disappear. The once fertile land dried up, transforming into a vast, inhospitable desert. The animals moved on, water sources vanished, and the people were left with a choice: perish or move. And so they moved. The first Egyptians were not builders, nor were they conquerors. They were survivors. With no maps, no knowledge of what lay ahead, they walked toward the last great river, the Nile. It was a journey of hundreds of miles, a desperate search for water, for life, for a future. Some never made it. Others arrived at its banks, weary but determined. And what they found would change the course of history. The Nile was more than a river. It was a lifeline. With its annual floods, it offered fertile soil in an otherwise barren landscape. Here, the first settlements began to form. People who once wandered now planted, harvested, and built. In time, they did something no humans before them had done. They carved the first symbols of gods into stone. One of the oldest of these sites, Nabta Playa, holds the key to understanding the first stirrings of Egyptian civilization. Hidden deep in the desert, this settlement, over 7,000 years old, reveals a society that was already looking beyond survival. Massive stone circles, aligned precisely with the stars, stand as silent witnesses to their knowledge. These people were tracking time itself, predicting the floods, aligning their world with something greater, the heavens. Among their carvings, a recurring image appears, a cow-headed figure. Long before pyramids and temples, The earliest Egyptians were already worshiping Hathor, the goddess of fertility and nourishment. But why? And what were they trying to predict? The answers lay not in the land, but in the stars. Before the pharaohs, Egypt's prehistoric roots. History tells us that Egypt was the land of kings, temples, and pyramids. But history is written by the victors, the pharaohs who shaped the narrative in their own image. What if Egypt's true origins lie not in royal tombs, but in forgotten carvings deep in the desert? Before the first pharaohs, before even the first cities, Egypt was shaped by forces far older than any human ruler. And to understand its rise, we must first uncover a civilization lost to time, one that thrived in a land now swallowed by the sands. 19,000 years ago, the forgotten artists of Khorta. In the cliffs of Khorta, not far from the Nile, lies one of Egypt's most overlooked mysteries, a collection of rock carvings etched with precision into ancient stone. They are older than the pyramids, older than agriculture, older even than settled life itself. But these are not the symbols of later Egyptian kings. They are something far older, something primal. The images depict towering aurochs, massive wild cattle that once roamed Africa. Their horns curve with unnatural grace. Their bodies are drawn in motion, full of power. To the people who created these carvings, the aurochs were not just animals. They were survival itself. But here's the strange part. The people who created these engravings were not yet farmers. They were hunters, nomads, wanderers. And yet, something about these creatures compelled them to leave their mark. Why? Some archaeologists believe these carvings were part of early rituals, perhaps an attempt to influence the hunt or an early form of religious reverence. Others suggest something more striking, that this was the first hint of Egypt's obsession with animal symbolism, the earliest seed of a belief system that would one day give rise to sacred bulls, falcon-headed gods, and the divine pharaoh himself. The Green Sahara, a vanished world 10,000 years ago, the world was unrecognizable. What we now call the Sahara was not a desert, but a paradise. Vast lakes stretched across the land, teeming with fish. Herds of elephants and giraffes roamed freely, and scattered among them were small groups of humans, people who, for thousands of years, followed the rhythms of this green and fertile land. They left behind evidence of their lives, tools, pottery, even burial sites. They were not yet farmers, but they were beginning to shape their environment in subtle ways. They followed the rains, hunted with precision, and lived in harmony with the land. But all of it was doomed to disappear. Around 8,000 years ago, the planet's climate began to change. The monsoon rains that had sustained the Green Sahara started to retreat. Slowly at first, barely noticeable within a single lifetime. But over centuries, the lakes shrank, the rivers dried up, and the great grasslands turned to dust. For those who lived here, survival meant one thing: movement. They began a slow exodus, searching for the last remaining source of water. Some traveled south, deeper into Africa. Others disappeared entirely, their fate lost to history. But one group did something different. They turned to the only constant in an increasingly hostile world: the Nile. The people who reached the Nile were not yet Egyptians. They were refugees of a vanished world, hunters and herders, forced by necessity to settle in one place. But the Nile was different from the land they had known. Its waters rose and fell with an almost divine precision, flooding the land at the same time each year, depositing rich, fertile soil. It was a gift, but one that required adaptation. These early settlers had a choice: continue wandering or learn to shape the land itself. And so, for the first time, they began to experiment. They planted seeds, watched them grow, and learned to control the rhythm of the river. Agriculture was born in Egypt, not as an invention, but as an act of survival. But even as they mastered the land, they did something else, something far more mysterious. They began to look to the stars. Far from the banks of the Nile, deep in the desert, lies one of the most astonishing discoveries in Egypt's prehistoric past, Nabta Playa. At first glance, it is little more than a scattering of stones, but to those who know how to read them, it is something else entirely, a circle of stone aligned with the rising and setting of specific stars, markers that indicate an advanced understanding of celestial movements. This is not a random structure, it is an observatory, and it predates Stonehenge by nearly 2,000 years. But why would people living 7,000 years ago care about the stars? One answer is survival. The Nile floods, the seasonal rains, the very cycles of life depended on patterns that could only be understood by looking skyward. But others believe this was something more. The earliest Egyptians were already beginning to see the cosmos as part of their world, a force that shaped their destiny. And if the stars dictated the flow of the Nile, did that mean the gods themselves were written in the heavens? This was more than just an observatory. It was the first step towards something far greater, a civilization built on the idea that the divine was not separate from the world, but woven into its very fabric. And from this moment forward, Egypt would never be the same. The first kings in the birth of a nation, a new interpretation. Civilizations do not emerge overnight. They rise from chaos, from conflict, from the ambitions of men who seek to carve their names into eternity. Egypt was no different. For millennia, its lands were divided. The Nile had given life, but it had also separated people into rival territories, each with their own customs, their own rulers, their own gods. And yet, in the shadows of history, a force was gathering, a force that would unite this fractured land under a single ruler, whether by diplomacy or destruction. But was Egypt's unification truly the vision of one man? Or was it a process far more complex than the legends suggest? Before Egypt became an empire, it was a battleground of ideas. Two cities would rise to prominence, each shaping the future of the kingdom in ways history has nearly forgotten. Hierakonpolis was the heart of innovation, the first city where brewing, metallurgy, and monumental construction flourished. Archaeologists have uncovered a mysterious temple complex here, one of the oldest known places of worship in Egypt. Some believe it was dedicated to Horus, the falcon-headed god of kingship. But here's the shocking part. This temple predates the pharaohs themselves. Could this mean that the idea of divine kingship was born not in the age of Narmer, but centuries before? Then there was Abydos, the city of the dead. Its rulers were buried in grand tombs long before the first dynasty. But a strange discovery has changed our understanding of its role. Beneath these tombs, archaeologists have found wooden boats, buried as if to carry the deceased into the afterlife. The burial of boats, a practice that would later define pharaonic burials, was already in place long before Egypt was officially united. Did these early rulers believe they were already gods? If so, the idea of divine kingship was not Narmer's invention. It was an inheritance from those who ruled before him. In 1995, archaeologists in Abydos uncovered something startling, a tomb belonging to King Scorpion. Not the Hollywood legend, but a real, tangible figure from history. Inside his tomb, they found dozens of ceramic jars filled with wine, imported from the Levant. This suggests something shocking. Egyptian kings were engaging in long-distance trade long before unification. But there's more. Among the discoveries was an early form of hieroglyphic writing, a list of goods, names, and cities. This was the first step toward the Egyptian writing system. If Scorpion King was merely a warlord, why did his court develop writing? Why was he buried with international goods? Could it be that he was more than just a military figure? Could he have been the first to imagine an Egypt beyond his own city? The Narmer Palette is often described as the first historical document. But here's the problem. It is not a written account. It is a piece of royal propaganda. It shows Narmer smiting his enemies, wearing the crowns of both Upper and Lower Egypt. But is this history or mythology? Some scholars now believe that Narmer did not conquer Egypt alone. Instead, he may have inherited a process already set in motion by rulers before him. The Scorpion King's military campaigns, the economic power of Hierakonpolis, the religious traditions of Abydos, all of these forces may have made unification inevitable. So why does Narmer get all the credit? Because history is written by those who seek to control it. Narmer's successors would use his image as a divine conqueror to justify their own rule. His story was carefully shaped, his victories mythologized. But the truth is more complicated. Egypt was not built by one man. It was built by centuries of struggle, alliances, and ambition. And as the first dynasty took power, a new question emerged. Could this fragile kingdom survive its own success? Would unification lead to stability or civil war? For thousands of years, the Nile divided two worlds. Upper Egypt in the south, a land of fierce warriors and rising city-states, and Lower Egypt in the north, a region rich with fertile lands and trade routes reaching the Mediterranean. These two lands had warred, traded, and coexisted in uneasy balance for centuries. And then suddenly, history changed. One name emerges from the dust of time, a warrior, a ruler, a symbol of power, Narmer. But was he truly the first pharaoh? Or was he the last in a long line of forgotten kings who paved the way for unification? The truth is more complicated than legend suggests. Historians have long debated when civilization truly began. Mesopotamia had its city-states. The Indus Valley had its vast trading hubs. But Egypt was something new. Narmer's unification of Upper and Lower Egypt is often called the creation of the world's first nation-state. Unlike fragmented city-states of Mesopotamia, Narmer's rule extended over a vast, continuous land, with a single government, a unified culture, and a divine ruler at its head. But unification wasn't a peaceful negotiation. It was war. How do we know? Because Narmer left behind the world's first piece of royal propaganda. Carved into siltstone over 5,000 years ago, the Narmer Palette is one of the most striking artifacts of ancient Egypt. Its meaning? A message to all who would dare challenge the new order. On one side, Narmer wears the white crown of Upper Egypt. He grips a defeated enemy by the hair, arm raised, about to strike. His sandal bearer stands behind him, because a king was not meant to touch the earth of a conquered land. On the other side, he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt. A procession follows him, with bodies of the fallen stacked beneath. Above them, a falcon, Horus, the god of kingship, standing on a cluster of papyrus plants, the symbol of Lower Egypt. This was not just a victory, it was a statement. I am the ruler of both lands. Resistance is futile. But was Narmer really the first to attempt this? Recent discoveries suggest that Narmer may not have been Egypt's first unifier. King Scorpion, a mysterious ruler who preceded Narmer, is depicted on a ceremonial mace head, wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt and leading conquests. Some believe Scorpion began the war Narmer would later finish. Others argue that Egypt was already on the path to unification, with alliances, intermarriages, and military campaigns softening the divide between Upper and Lower Egypt long before Narmer. But if that's true, then why was Narmer remembered as the great conqueror? The answer lies in what came next. Narmer's rule didn't just unify Egypt, it created Egypt. Before him, power was scattered. After him, it was centralized. He established the capital at Memphis, strategically placed between Upper and Lower Egypt to prevent rebellion. He controlled the trade routes, ensuring that goods from the Levant, Nubia, and the Red Sea all flowed through his kingdom. He initiated the first large-scale irrigation projects, transforming seasonal floods into agricultural wealth. And he laid the foundation for Pharaoh as a god. Unlike Mesopotamian kings, who were seen as servants of the gods, Narmer, and every pharaoh after him, was considered a living god on earth. This was no ordinary conquest. This was the birth of an empire. But if history has taught us one thing, it's that power never lasts forever. And Narmer's new world order? It was already at risk of unraveling. Would his successors hold the kingdom together? Or would Egypt collapse back into chaos? That is another story. For over 4,500 years, they have stood against time, the last remaining wonder of the ancient world. Their stones have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the shifting sands of conquest, and centuries of speculation about their creation. But who really built them, and how? The answer lies in an ancient papyrus buried deep in the Red Sea Mountains, a text that holds the oldest written record of pyramid construction. Yet even with this discovery, one of history's greatest mysteries remains unsolved. For centuries, the world believed slaves built the pyramids, the image of thousands of shackled workers driven by whips became an unshakable myth. But archaeology has shattered that idea. At the base of the pyramids, archaeologists found a lost city, a complex of worker dormitories, bakeries, breweries, and butcheries. It was not a prison camp. It was a city of engineers, craftsmen, and laborers, fed on a high-protein diet of beef and bread, a sign of their elite status. Graffiti left behind on the stones reveals their mindset. Crews proudly named themselves the Drunkards of Menkaure and the Friends of Khufu. These were not oppressed slaves, but loyal workers engaged in one of the most ambitious projects in human history. But who orchestrated this unprecedented feat? Before the Great Pyramid, before Giza, there was a man whose genius redefined Egyptian architecture forever. His name was Imhotep. He was not just an architect, he was a physician, a high priest, a mathematician. A man so revered that, centuries later, he was worshipped as a god. His boldest idea? To build not from mud brick, but from stone. For the first time in history, a tomb was no longer a mere burial chamber. It was a monument to eternity. His creation, the step pyramid of Djoser, was a prototype for everything that followed. But how did the Egyptians go from a simple step structure to the towering, geometrically perfect pyramids of Giza? The answer lies in a single pharaoh's ambition. Pharaoh Khufu wanted something unprecedented, a structure so vast it would touch the sky and defy time itself. His vision became the Great Pyramid of Giza, standing 146.6 meters tall, constructed from 2.3 million limestone blocks, each cut, transported, and placed with such precision that even today engineers struggle to comprehend it. But here's where history takes an unexpected turn. 1. The pyramid's base is level within just 2 centimeters, an accuracy almost unheard of in ancient construction. 2. The structure aligns almost perfectly with true north, using a method of stellar tracking that remains debated. 3. The ratio of its height to its perimeter is astonishingly close to the mathematical constant pi, a number supposedly discovered thousands of years later. Was this intentional, or a remarkable coincidence born from Egyptian measurement systems? And then there's the lost blueprint, the first written account of pyramid construction hidden for over 4,000 years. In 2013, archaeologists in the Egyptian desert uncovered a forgotten trove of papyri, records from the time of Khufu. These documents, belonging to a royal official named Merer, contain something never seen before: first-hand evidence of how the Great Pyramid was built. The documents described logistical operations, transporting massive limestone blocks from Tura to Giza, using a system of canals and barges. But while this solved one mystery, it opened up another. Because after Khufu, pyramid construction began to decline. Why? What happened to Egypt's golden age of engineering? And more importantly, was the Great Pyramid meant to be more than just a tomb? The answers lie in the next chapter of Egypt's history, a time of power struggles, shifting beliefs, and architectural experiments that would ultimately lead to the fall of pyramid building itself. For centuries, the world has marveled at the precision of ancient Egyptian stonework. How did a civilization, armed only with copper tools, shape granite as hard as steel, align massive blocks with near-microscopic accuracy, and construct monuments that have defied millennia? The answer lies buried in the stones themselves. Egypt's most enduring structures, temples, obelisks, statues, were not carved from soft limestone alone. Many were crafted from granite, diorite, and basalt, materials so hard that modern diamond-tipped tools are needed to cut them. Yet in Aswan, a massive unfinished obelisk, abandoned mid-carving, reveals something even more perplexing. The marks left on its surface show that workers were removing rock at a rate far beyond what simple chisels could achieve. So how did they do it? 1. Some scholars suggest dolerite pounders, massive hammerstones used to pulverize the surface. 2. Others propose abrasive copper saws with quartz sand. 3. But the sheer scale of precision suggests a technique that remains elusive, one that modern engineers still struggle to replicate. And then there's the biggest mystery of all, the perfectly drilled cores found in Egypt's ancient ruins. In various temples and workshops, cylindrical drill cores have been discovered. Rock samples removed from stone with such smooth precision that even today's machines struggle to match them. The cores reveal something astounding. 1. The spiral grooves suggest a cutting speed faster than any known ancient method. 2. Some cuts appear to penetrate granite at a rate beyond what copper tools could achieve. 3. A few even suggest the use of rotary drilling, thousands of years before the Industrial Revolution. Did the Egyptians develop a lost mechanical technique, a primitive form of lathe machining? Or did they possess a forgotten method of stonework that history has yet to rediscover? The truth remains locked within these ancient stones, waiting to be uncovered. But precision wasn't just about cutting, it was about alignment. The Great Pyramid's edges align within 1/15th of a degree of true north, a feat requiring astronomical calculations so advanced that some argue it should not have been possible at the time. The precision doesn't end there. 1. The Serapeum of Saqqara, a subterranean chamber, holds massive granite sarcophagi, each weighing over 80 tons, placed in corridors barely wide enough to maneuver them. 2. The columns of Karnak Temple rise with a uniformity that suggests a deep understanding of structural engineering. 3. Even the temples of Abu Simbel, carved directly into cliffs, were positioned so that twice a year, sunlight would illuminate the statue of Pharaoh Ramses II, while leaving the god of darkness in shadow. Coincidence, or proof that the ancient Egyptians mastered architectural alignment with a precision few cultures have ever achieved? Despite centuries of study, many aspects of Egypt's engineering remain a mystery. Were their methods simply lost to time? Or did they possess knowledge that defies our modern assumptions about ancient civilizations? One thing is certain, Their secrets are still buried in the stones, waiting to be revealed. Egypt's pyramids were not just monuments. They were messages. Messages carved in stone, whispering across time. We look at them today and wonder, what kind of civilization builds for eternity? But the pyramids were only one part of the story. The true legacy of Egypt isn't found in tombs, but in the lives of those who built them. The farmers, artisans, priests, and scribes whose world was shaped by an unshakable belief that death was not an end, it was a doorway. And to walk through that doorway, you had to understand the rules. The floodwaters have receded. The land is rich, black, ready for planting. In a village near modern-day Luxor, a farmer wakes before dawn, stretching aching muscles. He has no land of his own. All fields belong to the gods, the pharaoh, or the temple estates, but he is allowed to work them in exchange for a share of the harvest. His tools? Identical to those used thousands of years later, a simple wooden plow, a flint sickle, baskets woven from papyrus. His diet? Bread, onions, and beer, nothing like the feasts enjoyed by nobles. In the city, an apprentice scribe recites his lessons. A scribe's life is sweet, a farmer bends his back, a merchant risks the sea. But a scribe, he commands with words. It's propaganda, but it works. For women, life is different. Unlike in Greece or Mesopotamia, Egyptian women can own land, initiate divorce, and run businesses. Some even become priestesses of Hathor, managing temple wealth. But make no mistake, Egypt was still a patriarchal society, and power remained in the hands of men. Yet whether farmer, scribe, or priest, all Egyptians shared one unshakable fear. What happens after death? In the Old Kingdom, only kings could ascend to the heavens. Their tomb walls bear inscriptions, the pyramid texts, written to ensure the pharaoh's safe passage through the Duat, the underworld. But for everyone else, the journey was uncertain. The soul was split into multiple parts. One, the Ka, the life force, which needed food and offerings to survive. Two, the Ba, the personality, capable of moving between the living and the dead. Three, the Ak, the transformed immortal self, which could join the gods if one passed the final test. And that test was the weighing of the heart. Deep within the hall of two truths, the dead stood before Osiris. Their heart was placed on a scale, weighed against the feather of Ma'at. The gods watched, the scribes recorded. If the heart was heavy with sin, the soul was erased, devoured by Ammit, the eater of the dead. But if the scales balanced, the gates of eternity swung open. Still, one question remained. What if the gods themselves were no longer enough? The rise of new beliefs when Osiris challenged the gods. For centuries, only the pharaoh could claim a divine afterlife. But in a radical shift, the common people began to believe they too could achieve immortality. And the key to that belief was Osiris. Once a king, now the lord of the underworld, his story was unlike any other god's. Murdered, dismembered, and resurrected, Osiris became the symbol of death and rebirth, a god who had suffered, who had known pain, and who promised salvation not just to rulers, but to all Egyptians. This was a revolution in religious thought. For the first time, tombs of nobles and commoners alike carried spells once reserved for kings. The afterlife was no longer a privilege, it was a right. But what had changed? Some historians believe this shift was linked to climate disaster. Around 2200 BCE, the Nile's floods became unpredictable. Famine gripped the land. The Old Kingdom collapsed. And when the pharaohs could no longer guarantee stability, the people turned to gods who understood suffering. Osiris was one of them. The Old Kingdom may have ended, but its ideas endured for thousands of years. Its obsession with order, balance, and eternity shaped everything from architecture to law, from religion to daily life. The pyramids still stand, but their greatest achievement isn't stone. It's the idea that death is not an end, but a beginning. And that belief, written on papyrus, carved into tomb walls and whispered in prayers, outlived even the pharaohs themselves. For over 5 centuries, the Old Kingdom had stood as an unshakable force. The pyramids of Giza, the sprawling temples, and the unbroken rule of the pharaohs projected an illusion of eternal order. But even the most formidable empires crumble, not from the outside, but from within. What caused the fall of the Old Kingdom? Was it mere misfortune, or was Egypt doomed by its own ambition? The answer lies buried beneath sand and time, in the whispers of a civilization that once believed itself untouchable. For generations, the Nile had been Egypt's lifeline. Every year, its waters rose, flooding the fields, depositing rich black silt that fed an entire civilization. Egyptians called it Hapi, the sacred flood, the giver of life. But then, the flood stopped. Records carved into temple walls speak of a terrible drought, a time when the Nile, for reasons no one understood, failed to rise. The once fertile fields turned to dust, starvation spread, and as crops withered, so did the authority of the pharaohs. The god-kings, once believed to hold power over nature itself, now seemed helpless. From the capital of Memphis, royal decrees tried to maintain order. But outside the palace walls, famine bred desperation, and desperation bred rebellion. A fragment of an ancient text, the Admonitions of Ippur, tells us, "The river is dry, men cross it on foot. The poor have become rich, the rich have become poor. Order has collapsed, the land is in chaos." For the first time in recorded history, Egypt was no longer one nation. With the pharaoh's power shattered, rival factions rose from the shadows. In the north at Heracleopolis, a new dynasty of rulers emerged, desperate to cling to the remnants of the old ways. But in the south, in Thebes, a competing power was rising, one that would eventually reshape Egypt forever. For nearly a century, these two factions waged war, neither strong enough to claim total victory. Egypt had entered its first dark age. Yet in the midst of chaos, something new was taking root, a spirit of resilience. The Old Kingdom had been built on the idea that the pharaoh was divine, a god walking among men. But the first intermediate period shattered that belief. Without a single ruler holding power, local governors, the nomarchs, began ruling independently. Tombs from this era reveal something remarkable. For the first time, non-royal Egyptians began commissioning elaborate burials, complete with inscriptions once reserved for pharaohs. The idea that only kings could achieve the afterlife was fading. Now anyone who had wealth and status could claim a place among the gods. This was a revolution in Egyptian thought, a shift that would echo for millennia. For decades, the North and South remained locked in a stalemate. But in the city of Thebes, a new power was emerging, one that would reshape history. The Theban rulers, unlike their northern rivals, saw themselves as more than just warlords. They invoked the name of Amun, a once minor god whom they claimed had granted them divine right. This would change everything. By the end of the first intermediate period, Thebes had crushed its northern rivals, reuniting Egypt under a new dynasty. The rulers of Thebes would not just restore order, they would build a new Egypt, more powerful than ever before. And with their rise, a new kingdom was born, the Middle Kingdom. But one question remained. If the gods had abandoned the Old Kingdom, why should Egypt trust them now? The answer lay not in heaven, but in the minds of those who would rule next. Pharaohs who would not just rebuild an empire, but reshape its very soul. As Egypt faced its darkest hour, The pharaohs of Thebes quietly strengthened their grasp over the southern Nile Valley, but they had a secret weapon, the divine favor of Amun. This divine connection would ultimately tip the scales, but at what cost? The real question was whether Egypt could still trust its gods to lead them through this chaos, or if divine favor had become a mere political tool in the hands of the powerful. Pharaohs of the New Kingdom, Egypt's Golden Age. The New Kingdom represents one of the most dynamic and revolutionary periods in Egyptian history. It was an age where power, wealth, and religion intersected in ways that would reshape not just Egypt, but the ancient world. Yet behind the grandeur of pyramids, temples, and pharaohs, there were complex forces at play. Forces that would define the course of Egypt's future for centuries. The rise of Thutmose III, Egypt's warrior pharaoh. In the wake of Hatshepsut's controversial reign, Egypt stood at a crossroads. Thutmose III, a young pharaoh, inherited a fractured realm, a kingdom weakened by internal struggles and foreign threats. What made Thutmose different from his predecessors wasn't just his military genius, but his understanding that conquest would secure Egypt's future. But the story of Thutmose III's rise isn't simply one of military might. His genius lay in his ability to think several steps ahead, to not only defeat Egypt's enemies, but to control their minds through psychological warfare. His 17 campaigns were not just a show of brute force. They were part of a master plan to turn Egypt into the undisputed superpower of the ancient world. But one question remains: why did Thutmose, a man of brilliant military mind, go to such lengths to erase his predecessor's legacy? Was it pure political ambition, or did it stem from the tensions that existed between him and Hatshepsut, his stepmother, who ruled with a forceful presence as a female pharaoh in a male-dominated world? Hatshepsut's reign, though marked by monumental architectural achievements, was deeply controversial from the start. The first female pharaoh to don the full regalia of kingship, Hatshepsut faced enormous resistance from both the royal court and the people. But she wasn't just a regent. She was a pharaoh in her own right, controlling the Nile and commanding armies. Her reign was marked by economic prosperity, achieved through innovative trade routes and alliances with distant lands like Punt, whose legendary incense trees became symbols of her rule. Yet the question of Hatshepsut's rule transcends her accomplishments. Her self-styled image, complete with a false beard and male attire, was an assertion of power, but also of necessity. Could she have ruled in a more traditional way? Or was her persona a symbol of defiance against a system that denied women such power? After her death, her stepson Thutmose III's decision to destroy her statues and wipe her name from the record raises crucial questions about the nature of dynastic politics and gender in ancient Egypt. Was this erasure simply a political act, or was it a reflection of deeper societal anxieties about female sovereignty? In the 18th dynasty, Egypt was thrown into religious upheaval under Akhenaten, a pharaoh who dared to challenge Egypt's millennia-old polytheistic traditions. Akhenaten's revolutionary move to worship only the sun god, Aten, alienated the powerful priesthood of Amun and led to widespread unrest. His decision to abandon the traditional gods in their temples was not only a religious reformation, it was a political maneuver aimed at consolidating royal power. But what exactly drove Akhenaten to create such a radical religious shift? Was it divine inspiration, or was it a political strategy to undermine the power of the Amun priesthood, who had become too powerful under previous rulers? His attempt to transform Egyptian society didn't just result in the construction of a new capital city, Akhenaten, but also triggered a wave of destruction, an intentional erasure of Egypt's religious history that would be undone by his successors. Yet Akhenaten's legacy doesn't stop at the immediate collapse of his reforms. His monotheistic experiment may have influenced later religious developments, including the rise of monotheism in the Hebrew Bible. The questions surrounding his reign: was Akhenaten truly a visionary, or was he simply a madman, continue to perplex historians to this day. Tutankhamun, the boy king and the curse of the pharaohs. And then there was Tutankhamun, the boy king whose death at the age of 18 remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. His reign was brief and largely uneventful, but his tomb, discovered in 1922 by Howard Carter, was filled with unimaginable wealth, treasures that belonged to a king whose name had barely been remembered until then. But what drove Tutankhamun's death? Was it the result of a tragic accident, a murderous plot, or did his untimely passing reflect the chaos and instability of Egypt's royal succession? The theories continue to abound. Was it the result of intrigue within the palace? Or was it the bitter legacy of his restoration of the old gods after Akhenaten's reforms? Akhenaten's religious revolution, the roots of monotheism? Akhenaten's reign in the 18th dynasty remains one of Egypt's most enigmatic chapters. In the world of ancient Egypt, the pantheon of gods was an established fact, with the powerful Amun priesthood enjoying unparalleled influence. But Akhenaten, at the height of his power, did the unthinkable. He declared that there was only one god, Aten, the sun disk. To understand this radical shift, we must first recognize the political turmoil and priestly power that surrounded Egypt at the time. Atenism was more than just a religious shift. It was a calculated power play aimed at dethroning the Amun priesthood, who had become too powerful and wealthy. Akhenaten's reign marked the birth of a new city, Akhenaten, modern-day Amarna, devoted entirely to the worship of Aten. The old gods were abandoned, their temples destroyed, and the very fabric of Egyptian society was turned upside down. Was this an act of divine insight or political necessity? This is where the controversy begins. Some Egyptologists argue that Akhenaten was the world's first monotheist, a visionary who laid the groundwork for future Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Akhenaten's rejection of polytheism and his emphasis on a singular, all-powerful deity has drawn parallels with the later rise of monotheistic faiths. But was Akhenaten truly ahead of his time? Or was his religious revolution a failed experiment doomed to collapse with his death? As Akhenaten's rule progressed, the powerful priesthoods of Egypt, particularly those of Amun, fought back. The very fabric of Egyptian society was torn between the old beliefs and the revolutionary ideas of the pharaoh. But the tension didn't last long. After Akhenaten's death, his immediate successors, including Tutankhamun, reversed many of his policies. The city of Akhenaten was abandoned, and the traditional gods were reinstated. This dramatic shift raises a crucial question. Did Akhenaten's religious changes truly influence the world beyond Egypt? Some historians argue that the Abrahamic faiths owe a hidden debt to Akhenaten's reforms. After all, Judaism, which introduced the concept of a single, all-powerful God, appears to have emerged around the same time as Akhenaten's reign. The similarities between the monotheism of Akhenaten and the beliefs that would later define Judaism have led to widespread debate. Was there an intellectual exchange between Egypt and the Hebrew tribes during the Amarna period? Did the Hebrew people witness Akhenaten's reforms and adapt them into their own religious traditions? But here's where the plot thickens. What if Akhenaten's monotheism wasn't the root of these later religious developments? Historians like Toby Wilkinson argue that, while Akhenaten's ideas were undeniably revolutionary, they were largely isolated to Egypt. The collapse of Akhenaten's religious reforms left Egypt in turmoil, and the influence of his ideas on the Hebrews remains speculative at best. As the centuries passed, Akhenaten's name was all but erased from Egyptian history. His successors, eager to distance themselves from his unpopular reforms, actively destroyed his monuments and temples. Tutankhamun, in his brief reign, abandoned Amarna and sought to restore Egypt's ancient religious practices. Akhenaten's vision of monotheism was not just abandoned, it was buried, forgotten by the pharaohs who came after him. Yet the question remains, was Akhenaten's revolutionary thinking a precursor to later religious movements? Or was it simply a failed experiment that left no lasting imprint on the world? Some scholars claim that his reforms were too radical, too alien for the Egyptian worldview to sustain. However, others argue that the echoes of Akhenaten's bold experiment could be found in the rise of other monotheistic faiths. Could his religious experiment have sown the seeds for the development of a unified vision of God that would later flourish in the Hebrew and Christian traditions? As we dig deeper into this question, we are left with one final, tantalizing thought. Akhenaten's legacy may be far from over. Perhaps his vision, buried under the sands of time, continues to resonate, not in the temples of Egypt, but in the world's major religions today. Akhenaten's radical religious reforms may have been short-lived, but the echoes of his monotheistic vision persist to this day. In the next chapter, we will explore the enigmatic death of Tutankhamun, the boy king, and whether his mysterious end was tied to the unraveling of his father's revolutionary legacy. The Ramesside Empire and the Sea Peoples, the final flourish of Egypt's glory. As Egypt reached the pinnacle of its power under the Ramesside dynasty, the empire was filled with grand triumphs. But at what cost? Ramses II, the greatest of Egypt's pharaohs, left behind a legacy of monumental achievements, vast temples, military victories, and countless monuments. His name became synonymous with Egypt's glory, but beneath the surface, his reign marked the final chapter in Egypt's imperial era. The apex of his reign was the Battle of Kadesh. In 1274 BCE, Ramses led his army to face off with the mighty Hittites, ruled by King Muwatalli II. Despite the overwhelming size of the Hittite forces and an ambush that almost led to his capture, Ramses emerged with a diplomatic victory, signing what would become the first peace treaty in recorded history. This treaty, which involved the marriage of Ramses to a Hittite princess, would shape Egypt's foreign policy for generations. But was it truly a victory or the first sign of Egypt's vulnerability? Was Egypt's military dominance, in reality, starting to crumble under the weight of its own imperial overreach? Though Ramses II's Battle of Kadesh is often portrayed as a military success, historians continue to debate the true outcome. While Ramses certainly won the public relations battle, thanks to his propaganda efforts, some scholars argue that the real victory came years later when the peace treaty was signed. Ramses had, essentially, sacrificed military glory in exchange for stability, something that would become increasingly important as Egypt began to face more imminent threats. The Hittites, after all, were just one piece of the puzzle. The growing pressures from external forces, including the Sea Peoples, suggested that Egypt's empire, once unchallenged, could no longer rely solely on its military might to secure its future. For years, the Sea Peoples have been one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world. Who were they? How did they manage to devastate entire empires, including the Hittites and Mycenaeans, before focusing their destructive energies on Egypt? Evidence points to a coalition of maritime invaders, but their origins remain elusive. Some historians suggest they came from modern-day Greece or Anatolia, while others believe they may have been displaced peoples from across the Mediterranean. What is clear, however, is that their attacks marked the beginning of the end for Egypt. Ramses II may have defended Egypt against the Sea Peoples, but the cost of this defense drained resources and left Egypt vulnerable to more frequent attacks. The mysterious invaders are often blamed for Egypt's eventual fall, but how much of that is actually true? Did the Sea Peoples truly bring about Egypt's collapse? Or was it the weakened political structure and internal strife that finally took its toll? One thing is certain: the Ramesside Empire, though enduring in the short term, could not survive the onslaught of forces, both external and internal, that were gradually tearing it apart. While Ramses II's military triumphs and architectural feats solidified his place in Egyptian history, his successors faced a gradual decline in Egypt's centralized power. The peace treaty with the Hittites, though beneficial at the time, created an impossible balance between diplomacy and military preparedness. Successive rulers were not able to replicate Ramses' military genius, and with Egypt facing the persistent threats of the Sea Peoples, the internal tensions began to rise. Internal administrative corruption, weakening of royal authority, and a growing economic crisis led to an ineffective response to external threats. The Ramesside dynasty, though prosperous under Ramses II, began to fray at the edges as the empire lost its economic and military might. By the time Ramses III came to the throne, the once great civilization was facing an existential crisis. Could he rally Egypt's forces to defend the nation, or was the empire already doomed? The Sea Peoples' impact on Egypt is still a subject of intense debate, and while Ramses III fought valiantly, it's clear that Egypt's golden age was coming to an end. Was Ramses III the last great pharaoh, or was his reign simply the final stand of a civilization that had already reached its breaking point? Join us as we uncover the dramatic fall of Egypt and explore how this once mighty empire met its tragic decline. The final days Cleopatra and the Roman conquest. Cleopatra was not only a charismatic leader and political figure, she was a strategist whose every move was calculated for Egypt's survival. From the outset, Cleopatra knew that Egypt's future lay in balancing the delicate power dynamics between the growing Roman Empire and her own dwindling kingdom. She wasn't simply playing for the throne of Egypt, she was fighting for the future of Egyptian sovereignty itself. Her reign began with intense political maneuvering. Following the death of her father, Ptolemy XII, Cleopatra was thrust into the political fray, competing for power against her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. In the midst of family betrayal and court intrigue, she realized that to secure Egypt's future, she needed more than just political alliances. She needed Rome's favor, or at least Rome's tolerance. Her first calculated move came when she forged an unlikely partnership with Julius Caesar in 48 BCE. While Caesar was pivotal to her success, Cleopatra's shrewdness allowed her to outmaneuver rivals and secure her position. But as we'll see, Cleopatra's role in this relationship went far beyond mere seduction. She was a queen who could hold her own in the cutthroat world of Roman politics. Cleopatra's encounter with Caesar wasn't the romance of the century. This was a political move crafted with precision. Her invasion of Caesar's court was not a romantic whim, but a desperate gambit to restore her rule and secure Egypt's independence. While many focus on their relationship's personal aspects, Cleopatra's intellect is what made the alliance work. Together, Caesar and Cleopatra crushed her brother, Ptolemy XIII, and established her as the sole ruler of Egypt. Cleopatra didn't just rely on Caesar's military might. She used her mastery of diplomacy to appeal to the Roman world. She sought Caesar's endorsement not merely as a lover, but as a leader determined to rebuild Egypt's stature. But what was the price for this alliance? Cleopatra's relationship with Caesar wasn't without consequences. As she pushed for Egypt's autonomy, she was walking a fine line. Rome was becoming more involved in Egyptian affairs, but Cleopatra believed, perhaps naively, that she could use Caesar to restore Egypt's lost glory. The tragic irony, by the time of Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Cleopatra was left to face a world in which her ally had become a martyr, and Egypt was left vulnerable to the unstoppable march of Roman expansion. After Caesar's death, Cleopatra quickly aligned herself with Mark Antony, another powerful Roman leader who had been one of Caesar's lieutenants. But her relationship with Antony wasn't only about personal loyalty, it was about securing Egypt's future in a Rome that was increasingly moving toward imperial domination. Together, Cleopatra and Antony launched a series of political and military campaigns to bolster their rule. But their growing influence also made them enemies of Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. As tensions mounted between Antony and Octavian, Cleopatra's position became untenable. With the stakes higher than ever, she was forced to gamble everything on Antony's success. But the dice rolled against them. In 31 BCE, the Battle of Actium became the turning point. Cleopatra and Antony's forces suffered a crushing defeat by Octavian's fleet. The aftermath was not just military, this was the fall of an era. The defeat spelled the end of Egypt's sovereignty and marked the beginning of its subjugation under Roman rule. Following Actium, Cleopatra's options dwindled. Octavian's forces advanced on Alexandria, and her final chance to preserve Egypt's power was slipping away. Her ultimate choice to commit suicide was not the act of a defeated queen, but the tragic decision of a ruler who had exhausted every political option. Was this the inevitable end of Egypt's independence in the face of Roman expansion, or was it a result of Cleopatra's miscalculations? Did her political alliances with powerful Roman figures ultimately lead to her kingdom's collapse? Or did she simply misjudge the rising tide of Roman imperialism? These questions linger in the aftermath of Cleopatra's death. Cleopatra may have fallen, but her legacy remains a topic of intense debate. Did her attempts to resist Roman imperialism embody the last stand of an independent Egypt, or was her fall simply a matter of timing and circumstance? Cleopatra's political acumen was undeniable, but what could have been the future of Egypt if she had succeeded in her goal to balance Roman power and Egyptian sovereignty? Did she leave behind a blueprint for resistance that future generations could have followed? Or was her tragic end the inevitable result of a world turning toward empire? Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE was the end of an era, but her name is forever etched in the annals of history, not just as a lover or a queen, but as a leader who sought to defy the overwhelming forces of history. Her story continues to inspire those who wonder what might have been, and what Egypt's story might have looked like had it not been subsumed by Rome. The power of Egypt's influence, from the desert sands to the bustling streets of modern cities, ancient Egypt remains one of the most fascinating civilizations in human history. But beyond the pyramids and hieroglyphs, Egypt's influence stretches into every corner of our modern world. Why does Egypt still captivate us? Why do we keep returning to its stories, its gods, its mysteries, even after 3,000 years? The ancient Egyptians were master builders, but their innovations went beyond massive stone structures. The Pyramid of Djoser, for instance, introduced the concept of multi-story stone buildings that would influence architecture around the world. Yet the Great Pyramid of Giza, considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, is an enigma, built with precision that still eludes modern engineers. Modern architects and engineers debate how the Egyptians achieved such precise stone cutting and engineering feats. While many attribute this to sheer labor, the reality is far more complex. New studies suggest that Egyptians used advanced geometry and possibly lost techniques, such as sandstone molding, to create their masterpieces. But what happens when we look beyond just the architecture itself? Egypt's influence on urban planning set the framework for future cities. The careful design of temples, palaces, and commercial districts in the Nile Delta created a pattern of urban development that would influence ancient Greece and Rome. Egypt's religious complexity has fascinated historians for centuries. At the core of their beliefs was Ma'at, the principle of cosmic balance and truth. However, as Egyptian society evolved, so did its gods and its conception of what divinity meant. At the height of Egyptian civilization, polytheism dominated, with gods like Ra and Osiris representing the forces of creation and death. But this traditional belief system was shattered during the reign of Akhenaten, who abandoned Egypt's pantheon of gods in favor of a single, all-powerful deity, Aten, the sun disk. This radical departure was not just religious, it was political, aimed at consolidating power under a single royal authority. Akhenaten's monotheism has long been a topic of debate among Egyptologists. Was this the birth of monotheism, centuries before Judaism, Christianity, and Islam? Or was it a short-lived experiment, doomed to fail because of its disruption of a deeply ingrained cultural and religious order? The Egyptians weren't just architects. They were scientists in the truest sense. They were the first to develop a calendar system based on the solar year, which helped them predict the annual flooding of the Nile, critical for agriculture. They also studied astronomy, tracking the stars and their cycles to navigate the vast stretches of desert and to create the great temples that aligned with celestial events. But their scientific achievements were not only theoretical, they were practical. In medicine, Egyptians performed surgeries, including trepanation, skull surgery, and pioneered prescriptions still used today in modified forms. Their understanding of anatomy and treatments for ailments were recorded in the Ebers Papyrus, which wasn't just a medical textbook, but a reflection of Egypt's advanced understanding of the human body. The Rosetta Stone holds more than just linguistic importance. It is a key to understanding Egypt's entire civilization. Discovered in 1799, it unlocked the ancient Egyptian language, allowing scholars to finally read the hieroglyphs that had eluded them for centuries. The breakthrough provided a window into Egypt's culture, politics, and religion, offering us a direct link to a civilization that had been lost to time. But what happened next? How did the rediscovery of ancient Egypt reshape the world? The emergence of Egyptology opened up new paths for understanding not only Egypt, but also the entire history of the ancient world. What is it about ancient Egypt that still enthralls us? It's not just the pyramids or the pharaohs. It's the sheer mystery of a civilization that rose from nothing and ruled for thousands of years. It's the allure of lost knowledge, hidden treasures, and the question of what we still don't know. From the Nile to the Sphinx, from Cleopatra to Tutankhamun, Egypt continues to inspire, educate, and challenge us. Every year, new discoveries are made, pushing the boundaries of what we thought we knew about Egypt and its lasting influence on modern civilization. As the sands of Egypt continue to shift, what new mysteries will emerge? Could the answers to Egypt's lost technologies still be hidden in plain sight? Could the next discovery reshape our understanding of this great civilization once again? Stay tuned. The story of Egypt is far from over. From the very first stone block placed atop the pyramids of Giza to the rediscovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, Egypt's ancient legacy has continued to whisper the same promise: immortality. But what does immortality mean in the context of Egypt's mighty civilization? Is it simply the afterlife? Or does it represent something deeper, more profound, an attempt to cheat time itself? How far does the notion of immortality extend in Egyptian history? And how did this obsession shape their decisions, their architecture, and their fate? Let's begin with the cornerstone of Egyptian immortality, the pyramids. These massive tombs didn't just house the dead, they were part of an eternal strategy, built to withstand the ravages of time. But what happens when time itself is a player in Egypt's downfall? The pyramids of Giza were not just tombs. They were time capsules containing the very essence of Egypt's divine order. The Egyptians didn't simply seek to preserve the bodies of their pharaohs, they sought to preserve their eternal rule. Each stone, carefully positioned, was a defiant statement against the forces of decay. But here's where things get complex. How were the pyramids built? The typical story involves slaves, forced labor, and endless manpower. But the truth is far murkier. Recent evidence suggests that the labor force was made up of skilled workers, paid in food, shelter, and honor. These workers saw their work as a sacred duty, believing they were helping the pharaoh achieve divine immortality. However, was it really immortality that the pharaohs were after? Or was it the immortality of Egypt itself? The pyramids were a reflection of the pharaoh's power, meant to showcase Egypt's eternal grandeur, regardless of the ruler who lived or died. The Book of the Dead was the Egyptian guide to the afterlife, designed to ensure that the deceased could survive the trials of the underworld and reach paradise. But what's often overlooked is that the book wasn't just a manual for the dead, it was also a tool for immortalizing Egypt's knowledge. The book was not for just the elite. By the New Kingdom, it was available to anyone with the wealth to afford it. This was democratization, a rare form of egalitarianism in a society that viewed the pharaoh as a living god. But what does this mean for Egypt's sense of immortality? If everyone had access to the keys to eternal life, could Egypt's greatness have been seen as a shared cultural immortality, where even commoners were striving for the same eternal rebirth as their rulers? The ancient Egyptians' belief in immortality was not merely about individual survival. It was embedded in their very understanding of the cosmos. The cycle of life and death, flooding of the Nile, and the rejuvenation of the land were all seen as reflections of the divine immortality. Each pharaoh wasn't just a ruler, they were the cosmic stabilizer, ensuring that Egypt would be reborn every year through rituals and sacrifices. Consider the story of Osiris, the god who died and was reborn, offering a pattern that every Egyptian believed they could follow. The pharaoh was a direct reflection of Osiris, ensuring the country's survival through their own rebirth. Yet when Egypt's religious framework was challenged, such as by Akhenaten's monotheism, the immortality they had worked so hard to secure was threatened. Was this religious revolution a sign that Egypt's foundations were cracking? Even in the modern world, Egypt's immortality persists. We're captivated by the mysteries of the pyramids, the enigmatic pharaohs, and the allure of their gods. But why does Egypt still hold this eternal fascination? What is it about Egypt's symbols, from the Sphinx to the Rosetta Stone, that continue to inspire wonder? Some might say it's because Egypt's legacy transcends time. The immortal ideas of balance, Mayat, the scientific achievements in mathematics and medicine, and the architectural brilliance have shaped everything from Western religions to modern architecture. The lasting allure of Egyptology lies in its mysteries, the very ones that Egyptians intended never to be solved. In a way, Egypt's immortality is woven into our obsession with unlocking those secrets, because we are part of the immortal story they began. But even with all the wonders Egypt left behind, the greatest questions remain unanswered. What if the Egyptians were not just obsessed with their own immortality, but also with preserving a deeper cosmic secret, a knowledge so powerful that it could change the course of history once again? Could the next discovery, hidden in Egypt's sands, finally reveal what they truly believed would give them eternal power? If you found Egypt's immortal legacy as fascinating as we did, don't let history fade. Like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. What ancient mystery should we uncover next? Let us know below.